Good morning. All right, I'm going to give you a little behind the scenes thing, and I apologize. And I'm telling you this so that maybe you will persevere through my awful video. Um, I've been trying to read chapters 8 and chapters 9, and over again I run into technical difficulties. Chapter 8, I bet I read 3 or 4 times in total, trying to get it to work so that you could hear it and not be completely disgusted by my sound. And then chapter 9, I switched to another camera, hoping to get better things working, and turned out that it was worse, with a lot of buzzing, and I read it 2 or 3 times. So chapter 9 is what it is. There's a buzzing noise, but I'm hoping that right now you're not hearing a buzzing noise, and I'm going to test it out in a second, find out. And if it's not, then I will record chapter 10 this way. So anyway, the rest of chapter 9 here in just a minute is going to have a lot of buzzing noise. If you can't take it, which I would totally understand, I highly recommend you read the chapter for yourselves. Trying to do this as a service to my students, and it's not quite working out right anymore because I was recording everything on my phone, and my phone is not working the way it's supposed to now. So anyway, without further ado, rest of the video. Good morning. Well, at least it is while I'm reading this. I'm about to read chapter 9 of Living with Art, the 11th edition by Mark Getlein. And before I do, I'd like to point out that if you're like me, the whole book, looking at the whole book like this seems pretty overwhelming. But this is the second time that I'm reading through chapter 9, because the first time my microphone was not on. So it's not really that big a deal. You put aside an hour a day, you can have this book read in 23 days. Here we go. Chapter 9, Camera and Computer Arts. In the world of art, the camera and the computer were born yesterday. Although the earliest known drawn and painted images date back to the Stone Age, and the earliest surviving print was made well over 1,000 years ago, images recorded by a camera or created on a computer belong entirely to our modern era. The camera relies on natural phenomenon known since antiquity, that light reflected from an object can under controlled circumstances project an image of that object onto a surface. It was not until the 19th century, however, that a way was found to capture and preserve such a projected image. With that discovery, photography was born, and after photography, film and video, which recorded the projected image in motion over time. The computer, too, is rooted in discoveries of earlier times. The first true computer, an electronic machine that can be programmed to process information in the form of data, was built around 1938. Early computers were so large that a single machine occupied an entire room. Over the following decades, technological advances helped chipped away at the size, even as they made computers faster, more powerful, more affordable, and easier to use. Beginning around 1980, the pace of change accelerated so dramatically that we have come to speak of a digital revolution. The personal computer, a compact disc, the scanner, the World Wide Web, the digital video disc, and the digital camera appeared in rapid succession, together making it possible to capture, store, manipulate, and circulate text, images, and sound as digital data. With the digital revolution, the camera and the computer became intertwined. Camera and computer technologies are essential to businesses, advertising, education, government, mass media, and entertainment. They have commercial applications and personal applications, and they are widely available to both professional organizations and individual consumers. Among these individuals are artists who have carved out a space for human expression within the vast flow of information and images that the camera and the computer have enabled. This chapter explores the camera arts, photography, film, and video from their beginnings through the digital revolution. Then it looks at how artists have worked with possibilities opened up by the global reach of the internet. Photography. Coffee time. The earliest written record that has come down to us of the principle behind photography is from a Chinese philosopher named Mo Tai, who lived during the 5th century BCE. Mo Tai noticed that light passing through a pinhole opened into a darkened chamber would form an exact view of the world outside, but upside down. A century or so later, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle observed similar phenomena, and he wondered what caused them. Early in the 11th century CE, the Arab mathematician and physicist Abu al-Hasan, known in the West as Alhazen, set up an experiment in a dark room in which light from several candles passed through a pinhole in a partition, projecting images of the candle flames onto a surface on the other side. From his observations, Alhazen deducted correctly that light travels in straight lines, and he theorized, also correctly, that the human eye worked along the same principle. Light reflected from objects passes through the narrow opening of the iris, projecting an image of the outside world onto a surface in the dark interior. Alhazen's work circulated in translation in Europe, where early scientists continued his investigations into the behavior of light, but it was not until the Renaissance that a practical device was developed to harness those principles. It was known as the camera obscura, Latin for darkroom. You can make a camera obscura yourself. Find a light room, even a closet or a very large cardboard box. Pierce a small hole no bigger than the diameter of a pencil in one wall of the room to admit light. Inside, hold a sheet of white paper a few inches from the hole. You will see an image of the scene outside the room projected on the paper, upside down and rather blurry but recognizable. With the development of lenses during the 16th century, the camera obscura could be made to focus the image it projected. Artists of the time, concerned with making optically convincing presentations through perspective and chiaroscuro, welcomed this improved camera obscura as a drawing tool. The illustration here appeared in a book called The Great Art of Light and Shadow, published in 1646. It depicts an elaborate version of a portable camera obscura. Note the poles on the ground for carrying it. The roof and the fourth wall have been left out of the illustration to allow us to peer inside. Each of the four outer walls had a lens at its center. Two lenses are shown here at left and right. Entering through a trapdoor in the floor, marked F, the artist stood in an inner chamber made of four translucent paper screens. The man here is drawn in miniature. The chamber was not really quite so large. Each lens projected its view onto the paper chamber, and the artist traced the projections from the other side, thus not getting in the way of the light. It was none other than Leonardo da Vinci who suggested this arrangement. The still camera and its beginnings. Despite the sophistication of modern photographic equipment, the basic mechanism of the camera is simple, and it is no different in theory from that of the camera obscura. A camera is a light-tight box with an opening at one end to admit light, a lens to focus and refract the light, and a light-sensitive surface to receive the light image and hold it. The last of these, the holding of the image, was the major drawback of the camera obscura. It could project an image, but there was no way to preserve the image, much less walk away with it in your hand. It was to this end that a number of people in the 19th century directed their attention. One of those investigators was Joseph Niepce, a French inventor. Working with a specially coated pewter plate in the camera obscura, Niepce managed in 1826 to record a fuzzy version of the view from his window after an exposure of 8 hours. Although we may now consider Niepce's heliograph, as he called it, to be the first permanent photograph, the method was not really practical. Niepce was corresponding corresponding with other Frenchmen, Louis Jacques Monde Daguerre, who was also experimenting with methods to fix the photographic image. The two men worked separately and communicated in code to keep their progress from prying eyes. When Niepce died in 1833, his son Isidore continued the experiments. It was Daguerre, however, who in 1837 made the breakthrough, recording an image in a studio that was clear and sharp by methods that others could duplicate easily. Daguerre's light-sensitive surface was a copper plate coated with silver iodide, and he named his invention the Daguerreotype. Daguerre made the image illustrated here in 1839, the year the French government announced his discovery to the world. In the entrancing detail characteristic of daguerreotypes, it recorded a seemingly deserted boulevard in Paris. In fact, the boulevard was a bustling thoroughfare. To record an image, Daguerre's plate needed to be exposed to sunlight for 10 or even 20 minutes. The only person to stand still long enough to be recorded was a man who had stopped to have his shoe shined. He and the partially obscured shoe shiner are among the first people ever to appear in a photograph, and certainly the first to have their image taken without knowing it. Within 2 years after Daguerre's discovery was made public, dramatic improvements were made. From England came a better method for fixing the final image so that it didn't continue to change in the light, and also a more light-sensitive coating for the plate that reduced exposure time. From Vienna came an improved lens that gathered 16 times as much light as previous lenses, further reducing the exposure time to around 30 seconds. Although still a far cry from the split-second exposures that later technology would make possible, the daguerreotype was now posed to become the first commercially viable method for making permanent images from reflected light. Daguerre's invention caused great excitement throughout Europe and North America. Entrepreneurs and the general public alike were quick to see the potential of photography, especially for portraits. It is hard to realize now, but until photography came along, only the rich could afford to have their likenesses made. By sitting for a portrait painter, within 3 years after Daguerre made his plate, a daguerreotype gallery for portraits had opened up in New York, and such galleries soon proliferated. Yet for all its early success, the daguerreotype was ultimately a blind alley for photography. The process produced a positive image, an image in which light and dark values appear correctly. This image is unique and cannot be reproduced. The plate is the photograph. The future of photography instead lay with technology that produced a negative image, one in which light and dark values were reversed. This negative could be used again and again to create multiple positive images on light-sensitive paper. Instead of a single, precious, and delicate object, photography found its essence in an art potentially unlimited low-cost multiples. An early version of the negative-positive print process was the calotype, which used a paper negative. Toward the middle of the 19th century, the vastly superior collodion process was developed, which produced a negative on glass. Portraits remain an important use of the new medium, providing a steady source of income for commercial photographers. One of the finest portraitists of the time, however, was an amateur, an English woman named Julia Margaret Cameron. Cameron's social circle included some of the most famous writers, artists, and intellectuals of her time, and she drew on her friendships to create memorable portraits of such luminaries as the naturalist Charles Darwin, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the Shakespearean actress Ellen Terry, and the English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. Some of Cameron's loveliest photographs, though, portray someone who was not famous at all, her niece, Julia Jackson. In contrast to sharp focus and even lighting, preferred by commercial portrait photographers. Cameron explored more poetic effects with a softened focus and a moody play of light and shadow. Julia's calm, forthright gaze reaches out to our time from hers. She was 21 years old and about to be married to a man who would soon die. Her second marriage would produce two daughters, one a painter, the other the novelist Virginia Woolf. The long exposure time and bulky equipment of early photography meant that a photograph was still a special occasion and an occasion for standing still. By the 1880s, however, technical advances had reduced exposure time to a fraction of a second, allowing cameras to capture life as it happened, without asking it to pose. Then, in 1888, an American named George Eastman developed a camera called the Kodak that changed photography forever. Unlike earlier cameras, the Kodak was lightweight and handheld, which means it could be taken anywhere. Sold with the slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." The camera came loaded with a new invention, a roll of film, enough for 100 photographs. Users simply took pictures which quickly became known as snapshots and sent the camera back to the company. Their developed and printed photographs were returned to them along with their cameras reloaded with film. The Kodak and cameras like it opened photography up to amateurs, and it quickly became a popular hobby. Although serious photographers continue, and still continue, to oversee the development and printing of their own work, they too benefit from the portable, lightweight technology. Almost anywhere a person could go, a camera could go now. Almost anything a person could see, a camera could record. Daily life, the life any one of us lives, became photography's newest and perhaps most profound subject. Taken in 1910, Crow Camp, 1910, records a moment in the life of a Crow Indian family. A man stands in front of a dwelling, a teepee. In his arms, he gently cradles a child. His wife and his family look on from the foreground. The photograph may record a naming ceremony, a Crow tradition that continues to this day. Many fascinating photographs of American Indians have been preserved from early decades of photography, most taken by European Americans determined to document what they saw as an exotic, sometimes noble, sometimes savage, but certainly vanishing way of life. What is remarkable about the photograph, however, is precisely that it is unremarkable, an ordinary human moment of family affection and intimacy. Not incidentally, the photographer, Richard Throssell, was an American Indian himself, born with Cree heritage and later adopted by the Crow people. He had been living on the Crow reservation for 8 years when he captured this moment. The view is a view from inside, not "this is how we see you," but "this is how we see ourselves. This is what is important to us." Bearing witness and documenting. One way in which photography changed the world was in the sheer quantity of images that could be created and put into circulation. Whereas a painter might take weeks or even months to compose and execute a scene of daily life, a photographer would produce dozens of such scenes in a single day. But what purpose could this facility be put to? What was the advantage of quantity and speed? One early answer was that photography could record what was seen as history unfolded or preserve a visual record of what existed for a time. We could call these purposes bearing witness and documenting, and they continue to play important roles today. Photographs bearing witness to events appear in newspapers and magazines the world over. It was always this way. It wasn't always this way. Newspapers during the 19th century were illustrated with wood engravings or lithographs. Artists were sent as reporters to major news events or drew images after the fact based on eyewitness accounts. The first important conflict to be documented in photography was the American Civil War. Long exposure times, however, limited the photographs to posed portraits of images of the dead. Any action images that appeared with newspaper articles still had to be drawn, and even suitable photographs had to be recopied as engravings or lithographs, for the technology did not yet exist to print photographs commercially on ordinary paper. Then, around 1900, the first process for photomechanical reproduction, high-speed printing of photographs along with type, came into being, and with it, a new concept, photojournalism. Photojournalism quickly became concerned about more than just getting a photograph to illustrate an article. Although a single photograph may be all the general public sees at the time, photojournalists could create a significant body of work around an event, a place, or a culture. A historical episode that brought about the best and many of the finest photographers of the day was the Great Depression in the United States. The Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted until the onset of World War II, caused hardships for photographers as well as the population as a whole. To ease the first problem and document the second, the Farm Security Administration of the U.S. Department of Agriculture subsidized photographers and sent them out to record conditions across the nation. One of those photographers was Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange's travels for the FSA took her to nearly every part of the country. In one summer alone, she logged 17,000 miles in her car. Lange devoted her attention to the migrants who had been uprooted from their farms by the combined effects of depression and drought. Lange's best-known image from this time is the haunting migrant mother. From this worried mother in her tattered clothing, from the two children who huddled against her, hiding their faces from strangers with a camera, Lange created a photograph that touched the hearts of the world. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. The photographer recalled years later. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. FSA photos like this one were offered free to newspapers and magazines. A photograph, of course, shows us the present moment, a split second of today. But the present is always slipping into the past, and what exists today may well not exist tomorrow. That basic realization inspires photographers who use their artistic skills to document. Raghubir Singh, for example, devoted much of his career to documenting life in the vast and varied subcontinent of India. Singh realized the importance of his project while traveling around India with a colleague, a famous American photographer. Singh noticed that the subjects that attracted the American were not the same as ones he himself was drawn to. I realized that the beauty of my homeland meant little to him. Singh later wrote, following artistic trends current in the West, the American wanted to create stark black and white images of the poorest neighborhoods in India's chaotic, overcrowded cities. Singh, in contrast, saw what he described as the lyric poetry inherent in the life of India. He insisted that it could be captured only in color, which he viewed as an essential element of Indian culture. The lyric poetry that delighted Singh is evident in his image of a family, Kamathipura, Mumbai, Maharashtra. Formerly known as Bombay, Mumbai is a major metropolis that attracts a constant stream of immigrants from small towns and rural regions. They come to cities looking for work, and many, like this family, end up living on the streets. Singh's photograph does not document their conditions so much as capture a moment of unexpected beauty and mystery that passed through them. Repeating reds link the scene before us to the poster on the wall. The sensuous woman depicted there seems to have some relationship, though we cannot say precisely what it is, with the gentle woman in yellow who lowers her gaze. Photography and art. The development of photography has been seen as freeing painting and sculpture from practical tasks such as recording appearances and events, and it is certainly true that Western artists began to explore the potential of abstraction and non-representation only after photography was well established. Ironically, to many people's way of thinking, the older forms took the definition of art with them, leaving photography to assume many of the traditional functions of art with none of the rewards. Yet from the beginning, there were photographers and critics who insisted that photography could be practiced as an art. Today, over 150 years later, photography is fully integrated into the art world of museums and galleries, and many artists who are not primarily photographers work with photographic images. This brief section looks at how photography found its way both as an art and into art. One characteristic of photographs that disqualified them as art in many people's eyes was the sharply detailed objectivity which seemed to preclude personal expression. Another stumbling block was the medium's increasing popularity and ease. The recently introduced Kodak camera had brought photography within reach of almost everyone, reinforcing the notion that it was simply a matter of framing the view and pushing a button. As Eastman's slogan promised, we do the rest. It was precisely the rest that obsessed the photographers of the international pictorialist movement, the most influential of the movements that sought to have photography accepted as an art. Pictorialists embraced labor-intensive printing techniques that allowed them to blur unwanted detail, enhance tonal images, soften focus, and add highlights and delicate veils of color, resulting in images that drew close to painting in their effects. A classic example of pictorialism in America is Edward Steichen's The Flatiron, one of New York's early skyscrapers. The Flatiron building was only 2 years old when Steichen photographed it. His moody, atmospheric image bears a clear debt to Whistler's Nocturne in Blue and Gold and the Japanese prints that inspired it, thus staking a claim to citizenship in the realm of art. Pictorialism flourished from 1889 until the outbreak of World War I, during which time it successfully demonstrated that photographs could be as beautiful and expressive as paintings. But with the developments such as abstraction, cubism, and non-representationism, painting was changing, and photography would change as well. In retrospect, the image that most clearly foretold the new direction was the steerage. By Steichen's pictorialist colleague Alfred Stieglitz, the story of how the steerage was made is often told both for its inherent drama and because it makes a point about what Stieglitz thought a photograph should be. In 1907, Stieglitz was aboard the ship on his way to Europe, traveling first class. One day, as he was walking the deck, he happened to look down into the lowest class section, called steerage. Before him, he saw a perfectly composed photograph, the smokestack leaning to the left at one end, the iron stairway leaning to the right on the other, the chained drawbridge cutting across, even such details as the round straw hat on the man looking down, and the grouping of women and children below. Stieglitz knew he had only one unexposed plate left, the equivalent of one exposure at the end of a roll of film. He raced to his cabin to get his camera. When he returned, the scene was exactly the same. No one had moved. That one plate became the steerage. The type of photography that Stieglitz championed came to be known as pure or straight photography. Practitioners of straight photography considered it a point of honor not to crop or manipulate their photographs in any way. The composition is entirely visualized in advance, framed with the viewfinder, then photographed and printed. With its emphasis on formal values and faithfulness to the essence of the medium, the aesthetic of straight photography was enormously influential for much of the 20th century. Steichen and Stieglitz practiced photography as an art. Other artists have made photography itself part of the subject of their art, examining its role in society and the particular vision of the world it promotes and the assumptions we make about it. One of the first artists to look critically at photography was Hannah Hoch. Born in 1889, Hoch came of age during the decades when photomechanical reproduction first allowed photographic images to appear in newspapers, periodicals, posters, and advertising. Everyday life was suddenly flooded with images, and the constant flow of second-hand reality began began to compete with direct experience. Hock's response was to use these found images as a new kind of raw material. In works such as Cut with a Kitchen Knife, she combined images and letters she had clipped from printed sources to portray the overwhelming experience of a modern city with its masses of people and machines. The word Dada, that appears in several places refers to the art movement that Hock belonged to. Dada was formed in 1916 as a reaction to the unprecedented slaughter of World War I, which was then being fought. The word Dada itself has no meaning, for faced with the horror of mechanized killing and the corruption of the societies that allowed it, Dada refused to make sense in traditional ways. A Dada manifesto written in 1918, the year the war ended, called for an art which has been visibly shattered by the explosions of the last week, which is forever trying to collect its limbs after yesterday's crash. The best and most extraordinary artists will be those who every hour snatch the tatters of their bodies out of the frenzied cataract of life. Hock, for her part, spent her life snatching bits and pieces from the frenzied cataract of images. Another artist formed by the ideas of Dada was Emanuel Radnitsky, better known as Man Ray. Trained as a painter, Man Ray initially learned photography to document his paintings. When a year or two later he turned his attention to the art of photography itself, he reacted with characteristic Dada abandon. He threw away the camera. Instead of placing himself before the world armed with the camera and film, Man Ray retired to the darkroom and began to experiment with light-sensitive paper that photographs are printed on. He discovered that an object placed on the paper would leave its own shadow in white when the paper darkened upon exposure to light. Working with that simple idea, he invented a technique called the rayograph, also known as the rayogram. Through such simple strategies as shifting the objects over time, suspending them at various heights over the paper, removing some and adding others, shifting the light source, Man Ray created mysterious images that looked like ordinary photographs, but that did not correspond to preconceived ideas of what a photograph was. Rayographs are far removed from the ideal of straight photography championed by Stiglitz and his followers. Yet if we think of photography as a tool for making images instead of as a tool for recording the world, then there are no right or wrong ways to use it, only choices, discoveries, and experiments. One complaint that had been lodged against photography from the very beginning was that it recorded the world in black and white instead of in full color. Early techniques for color were in place by around 1910, but it was not until 1930s that color began to be widely used, and then only in advertising. Serious photographers continued for decades to prefer black and white, feeling that color lacked dignity and was suitable only for vulgar commercial photography. Such prejudices began to crumble during the 1960s and 1970s. Today, many artists have adopted color photography as a primary means of making images. One such artist is Cindy Sherman. Sherman uses photography to create images of herself as someone else, often a woman she has invented or a woman who appears in famous work of art. The characters that Sherman invents seem to represent types rather than individuals. The abandoned girlfriend, the vengeful hussy, the pert secretary, the societal drunk, the party girl, the androgynous youth, and many others. Yet as we look, we realize that these are categories that we ourselves bring to the images, for the photographs are all called simply untitled. Here, for example, is Untitled number 123. As you invent a story for the woman Sherman portrays, you will find that you have made assumptions about what kind of person she is, assumptions based in part on the stereotypes you have absorbed through the films, television shows, and advertising images that surround us. The computer has been welcomed by many artists who work with photography as a natural extension of the medium. Developed during the 1990s, digital cameras use no film at all, but instead store photographs as data. For photojournalists, digital cameras allow images to be transmitted back to a newspaper over the internet. For artists, the technology allows them to gather photographic images, feed them into a computer, work with them, and print the end product as a photograph. I'm not reading these sidebars, but I'm sure that there are questions on the quiz from the sidebars, so I recommend that you go through and read those. Andre Gerxey uses both film and digital technology to create works such as Shanghai. Gerxey shoots his initial photographs with a large format camera on individual 5x7 inch sheets of color film. He scans the resulting negatives into the computer. Using photo editing software, he combines the negative into a single seamless image, which he modifies until he is satisfied with every detail. The result is then generated as a new color negative and printed as a photograph, a very large photograph. At almost 10 feet in height, Shanghai has the kind of forceful presence we usually associate with paintings or billboards. In fact, like color and digital manipulation, large sizes were first pioneered in advertising. Gerxey's success as an artist makes it possible for him to absorb the cost associated with creating photographs on this scale. It also enables him to travel to such places as Shanghai, where he found the Cavernous Hotel, a pure product of globalization. The anonymous interior could just as easily be in Atlanta, Sydney, Berlin, or any other number of other cities. Thomas Ruff takes the use of the computer a step further in a series of works he calls substrata, meaning underlayers. Rather than scan his own photographs into the computer, Ruff downloads images he finds on the internet. For the Substrata series, Ruff used images taken from Japanese manga, comic books, and animated films. Ruff layers the images one on top of the other, making them difficult to decipher individually. He manipulates the resulting images, blurring the contours until all traces of recognizable representation have disappeared, then prints the result. Like Gerxey, Ruff works on a very large scale. Substrata 12:3, illustrated here, is over 8 feet in height. In the tradition of Man Ray, Ruff has produced photographs without the aid of camera at all. The raw materials he uses, manga images depict stories about fantasy worlds. When Ruff finds the images, they are doubly disconnected from reality, but once their imaginary subject matter, and a second time through their virtual existence on the internet. Once by their imaginary subject matter, and a second time through their virtual existence on the internet. Layering and blurring them, Ruff further dissolves their stories until they have no memory of their former life, existing only as a glowing, pulsating, jewel-toned field of light on a monitor. Then he gives them new material form as a photograph. Film. Throughout history, artists have tried to create the illusion of motion in a still image. Painters have drawn galloping horses, running people, action of all kinds, never being sure that their depictions of the movement were correct and lifelike. To draw a running horse with absolute realism, for instance, the artist would have to freeze the horse in one moment of the run, but because the motion is too quick for the eye to follow, the artist had no assurance a running horse ever does take a particular pose. In 1878, a man named Edward Muybridge addressed this problem, and the story behind the solution is a classic in the history of photography. Leland Stanford, a former governor of California, had bet a friend $25,000 that a horse at full gallop sometimes has all 4 feet off the ground. Since observation by the naked eye could not settle the bet one way or the other, Stanford hired Muybridge, known as a photographer of landscapes, to photograph one of the governor's racehorses. Muybridge devised an ingenious method to take the pictures. He set up 24 cameras, each connected to a black thread stretched across the racecourse. As Stanford's mare ran down the track, she snapped the threads that triggered the camera's shutters and proved conclusively that a running horse does gather all 4 feet off the ground at certain times. Stanford won the bet, and Muybridge went on to more ambitious studies of motion. In 1887, he published Animal Locomotion, his most important work, with 781 plates of people and animals. In sequential motion, animal locomotion allowed the world to see for the first time what positions living creatures really assume when they move. Edward Muybridge's experiments in the 1880s had 2 distinct descendants. One was stop-motion photography, which became possible as both films and camera became faster and faster. The other was continuous motion photography. Undoubtedly, Muybridge had whetted the public's appetite to see real motion captured on film. The little room with a view had glimpsed a different world, a world that does not stand still but spins and moves and dances. The origins of motion pictures. Film depends on a phenomenon called persistence of vision. The human brain retains a visual image for a fraction of a second longer than the eye actually records it. If this were not true, your visual perception of the world would be continually interrupted by blinks of your eye. Instead, your brain carries over the visual image during the split second while the eyes are closed. Simultaneously, the brain carries over when still images are flashed before the eyes with only the briefest space between them. Motion picture is not real motion, but a series of still images projected at a speed of 24 frames per second, which makes the action seem continuous. Interest in moving pictures really predates the development of the still camera. As early as 1832, a toy was patented in Europe in which a series of drawn images, each slightly different from the next, was made to spin in a revolving wheel so that the image appeared to move. Edward Muybridge later applied this principle to his multiple photographic images, spinning them in a wheel he called the zoopraxiscope. Commercial applications of the motion picture, however, awaited 3 major developments. In 1888, American George Eastman introduced celluloid film, which made it possible to string images together. Another big step was taken by Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor. It was in Edison's laboratory in 1894 that technicians created what was apparently the first genuine motion picture. Lasting only a few seconds, the film was made on celluloid. Its star was one of Edison's mechanics, a man who could sneeze amusingly on command. Its title, Fred Ott's Sneeze. One major problem remained. There was no satisfactory method for projecting the film to an audience. Here, the challenge was taken up by 2 Frenchmen, brothers appropriately named Lumiere. Lumiere means light, who in 1895 succeeded in building a workable film projector. In December of that year, they held the first commercial film screening in history, showing a program of 10 short films to a paying audience in a large Paris cafe. From that point, the motion picture industry was off and running. Exploring possibilities. From the beginning of motion pictures, there was no doubt about what the new technology would do best. At last, visual art could tell stories. Paintings had always been able to allude to stories or imply stories or depict episodes from stories. Photography could do those things as well, but with film, stories could unfold over time and in motion, as they did in life or on stage in the theater. One early film that the Lumiere brothers showed told a brief, real-life story about a train pulling into a station. It was a documentary of something that had happened. Of course, not all stories we tell are set in the present time or the real world, at least not in the parts of where a camera can travel. They may be set in an imaginary future, or in the historical past, or at the bottom of the sea, or at the center of the earth. Early filmmakers, already familiar with tricks that photography could play, quickly set out to explore the new medium's ability to tell imaginary tales. A wonderful early example is A Trip to the Moon by the French filmmaker Georges Méliès. Méliès made his film in 1902 when space travel was far in the future. One of the first science fiction films ever made, A Trip to the Moon tells the story of a group of scientists who travel to the moon. How do they get there? They invent a space gun, which looks a lot like a cannon, and shoot themselves into space in a capsule that looks like a giant bullet. After landing smack in the moon's eye, ouch, the adventurers do battle with a race of underground moonbeings. The moon people win, taking the invaders prisoner, but the scientists manage to escape and return to Earth, where they are greeted by a cheering crowd. Méliès created this 14-minute film in a studio using painted scenery, just like that for a theatrical production. By the simple means of stop-motion photography, he also created sophisticated special effects. For example, on the moon, an open umbrella belonging to one of the scientists suddenly turns into a giant mushroom. Méliès filmed the umbrella, then stopped the camera, replaced the umbrella with the mushroom, and began filming again. When the film was shown, the transformation seemed to happen by magic. Méliès made his film using human actors. Other early filmmakers quickly discovered that stories could be acted by objects or drawings that seemed to come to life by themselves. A magical effect called animation, meaning it takes advantage of the fact that although a film camera can shoot continuously as motion unfolds, it can also shoot a single frame of film at a time. If you place, say, a spoon on a table, then shoot a single frame of it, then shift the spoon slightly and shoot another frame, then shift it again and shoot a third frame, when the film is projected, the spoon will appear to move by itself. Animated objects in this way is called pixelation, and early filmmakers were quite inventive with it. A French film made in 1907 included a sequence in which a knife buttered a piece of breakfast toast all by itself. Hand-drawn animation works on the same frame-by-frame principle, except that in this case it is a drawing or a cartoon that is photographed, not an object. To imagine the work involved, look back at Muybridge's sequential photographs of a horse galloping. If you drew each of those images and photographed your drawings in sequence, you would produce a very short animated film. Animation is a time-consuming and laborious way of making a movie. For between 12 and 24 drawings are required per second of running time to create the illusion of smooth motion. An animated cartoon, only 3 minutes in length, may thus require up to 4,320 individual drawings. One of the pioneers of animation in the United States was Winsor McCay. Before turning to animation, McCay was already famous for his innovative comic strip Little Nemo, which he began drawing for the New York Daily Herald in 1905. He was also a successful stage performer where he appeared as a chalk talk artist, someone who told stories and illustrated them at the same time on a chalkboard. McCay made several short animation features, but his most famous creation was Gertie, the trained dinosaur. McCay created Gertie for his stage act. He had her projected onto a large sketchpad set on an easel. The effect was as though one of his own drawings had suddenly come to life. McCay interacted with the cartoon as it played, scolding Gertie, for example, who reacted by acting contrite. Gertie was not the first animal character invented for animation features, but she was the first to have distinct personality, and as such, she is the ancestor of Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, and other famous animated animal characters. When it came to filming the story, early filmmakers looked naturally in theater as a model. At their most basic, they set up a camera in front of a stage performance and let it record the view, as though the camera were an audience member who stared straight ahead and never blinked. In fact, however, as audience members, we don't quite sit and stare at the entire stage. We focus here and there. We follow the action. We concentrate sometimes on the setting. sometimes on a face, sometimes on a gesture. Filmmakers soon realized that the camera could do those things as well, entering the story and making it more vivid for spectators. A camera could film from close up or from a distance. It could film from above or from below, or to one side. It could film while moving toward or pulling back from gliding alongside a view. It could film while turning from left to right, or right to left, or scanning from high to low or low to high. In all of those ways, a camera could film a shot, a continuous sequence of frames. Planning what kinds of shots to film quickly became an important aspect of gathering the raw material for a movie. The shots were then edited, pieced together to create storytelling sequences, which were in turn joined to create a complete film. Editing quickly emerged as fundamental to effective filmmaking. One of the most influential early masters of editing was the Soviet-Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Many filmmakers had concerned themselves with editing for clarity and continuity, making sure that shots followed each other smoothly and logically so that the audience could follow the story. Eisenstein, however, became just as interested in the expressive possibilities of editing, including changing the rhythm of how quickly one shot succeeded another, breaking a single action down into several shots, and alternating shots of different subjects so that the viewers would understand a symbolic connection between them. Many of Eisenstein's editing techniques can be seen in Battleship Potemkin, a 1925 film that became an international hit. The movie tells the story of an uprising by sailors angered at how unjustly they have been treated by their ship's officers. In one scene, a sailor's anger boils over while he and some shipmates were washing dishes. He raises a dish over his head and smashes it to bits on the counter. Eisenstein used 10 shots for the action, editing them together in such a rapid and violent rhythm that the brief moment stands apart from everything that had happened before, and its full importance clear. With special effects, animation, and editing, the fundamental possibilities of film as a visual medium were identified and explored by the very first generation of filmmakers. A steady stream of technological advances since then has provided today's filmmakers with a far more sophisticated set of tools to work with, but the essential elements of filmmaking have not changed. Film and art. Film was held initially as a wonderful medium for creating popular entertainments and disseminating information. Yet from the beginning there were people who claimed that, like photography, it could be practiced as an art. During the 1920s, the expression art cinema came into use, usually to indicate an independent movie that did not conform to popular storytelling techniques or aim to please a mass audience. Often these films were shown by small specialized theaters, by cinema societies, or even by art museums, a networking of venues that existed apart from the major commercial theaters. But in such a collaborative medium as film, who was the artist? The actors? The writers? The editor who put it together? All of them were artists in a way. Yet the most satisfying films, most viewers agreed, were those that seemed to be guided by a single vision. Many felt that this person was the director. During the 1950s, a group of young French film critics articulated this view with special force. The director, they said, was a film's auteur, French for author. An auteur is a director whose films are marked by consistent individual style, just as traditional artist paintings or sculptures are. This style is the result of directors' control over many aspects of the films as possible. Usually, an auteur will be closely involved in conceiving the idea for the film story and in writing the script. He or she will direct the film, work with the camera's operators to plan and frame each shot, then work closely with the editor when the final film is assembled. The young critics behind the auteur's concept were hoping to become filmmakers themselves, and their writings described the kinds of films they admired and wanted to make, and make them they did. In the process launching a vibrant movement known as the New Wave. One of the first New Wave films to appear was Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless. The story of Breathless is fairly simple. A handsome, pretty criminal steals a car and heads to Paris. On the way, he shoots a policeman who had pulled him over for speeding. In Paris, he meets up with a pretty American student journalist he knows. They talk, make love, go to the movies, steal cars, and plan to escape to Italy. But Patricia does not want to be in love, and to prove to herself that she isn't, she calls the police and turns Michael in. The revolutionary nature of Breathless does not lie in the story, however, but in the way it is told. The rhythms of the editing are fast and nervous, giving the film a spontaneous, youthful energy. Jump cuts where either the figures or the background change abruptly, interrupting the smooth visual flow abound. The camera is sometimes unsteady, as though it were being held by someone walking. The dialogue is part gangster film, part philosophy, and includes quotes from famous works of literature. Finally, the film contained allusions to famous films of the past, and the actors play characters who have been formed as much by the movies as by anything else. With the New Wave, the movies became self-conscious, just as a painting had almost a century earlier. We might say that film called a new kind of artist into being, someone as finely tuned to words as to images, gifted in structuring an experience that unfolds over time, able to communicate and collaborate with actors and production specialists, and as aware of the heritage of great films as painters are the heritage of great paintings. As for traditionally trained visual artists, the expense of making a film, together with the specialized equipment and technical knowledge involved, generally kept them from experimenting with a new medium. It would not be until the invention of video, discussed later in this chapter, that visual artists began to work with recorded time and motion in significant numbers. Nevertheless, alongside the rich international history of the film industry runs a slender history of films by artists. One artist who had an unusually prolific engagement with film was Andy Warhol. Warhol was one of the leading artists of the pop art movement during the 1960s. Pop is short for popular, and nothing was more popular by that time than the movies. Affordable film cameras had become widely available to the general public, leading to a thriving scene in underground or experimental filmmaking. Warhol had rented a large loft space in downtown New York. He called it the Factory, for it was a place where his art was to be manufactured by himself, his assistants, his friends, hangers-on, visiting celebrities, and all manner of people. In that setting, Warhol began making films. Warhol's early films were all silent and filmed in black and white. They resembled his paintings of the time in that they challenged our idea that something will happen. For example, Warhol's 1963 film Kiss consisted of close-ups of couple after couple kissing for 3 minutes, much like his paintings of soup cans consisted of can after can of soup, sometimes all the same flavor, sometimes different flavors. An even more radical film, Empire, followed the next year. Warhol and some friends set up a rented camera on the 14th floor of a building with a view of the Empire State Building. They filmed the Empire State Building for over 6 hours, from dusk until around 3 a.m. During all that time, the camera did not move. The composition showed the illustration here did not change. The reels of film were then spliced end to end and projected at a slower speed, producing an 8-hour film. What was the film about? Empire, Warhol said, was a way of watching time pass. Artists also began to use film to document actions or activities that they were proposing as art. One of the most influential artists to do this was Bruce Nauman. When a young artist, just at the start of his career, Nauman had begun teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute. Whereas a new faculty member, he found himself isolated. I had no support structure for my art then. There was no chance to talk about my work, he later recalled. And a lot of things I was doing didn't make sense, so I quit doing them. That left me alone in the studio. This, in turn, raised the fundamental question of what an artist does when left alone in the studio. My conclusion was that if I was an artist and I was in the studio, then whatever I was doing in the studio must be art. At this point, art became more of an activity and less of a product. Nauman began structuring activities by naming them, thereby setting limits. Then he filmed himself performing the activities in a studio. Typical activities had bland, descriptive titles such as bouncing two balls between the floor and ceiling with changing rhythms, or dance, or exercise. On the perimeter of a... Let me try that again. The title of this is Dance or Exercise on the Perimeter of a Square Dance. The plain titles were matched by plain, unedited camera work. Like Warhol in Empire, Nauman set the camera on a stand, turned it on, and let it record whatever happened in front of it. For Dance or Exercise on the Perimeter of a Square, Nauman outlined a square on a studio floor with masking tape and marked the midpoint of each side. The dance or exercise Nauman devised is repetitive. Standing at the midpoint of the length of the square, he alternatively taps the corner to his right with his right foot, then the corner to his left with his left foot, in time to the beat of a metronome. He repeats this action 60 times, 30 times per foot, then moves to the next midpoint. He works his way around the square clockwise facing outward, then clockwise facing inward. The video ends. Without being a dancer, Nauman conceived of the activities as dance problems, and he practiced each piece extensively before performing it for the camera, becoming aware of his body and space and gaining control over the movements. Video. Warhol made virtually all his films during the 5 years between 1963 and 1968. During those same years, another technology that could record and playback images in motion was made available to the general public, and it quickly became more popular with artists than film had ever been. That technology was video. Just as radio had been invented to allow sound captured by a microphone to be transmitted over the air, so video was invented to do the same for moving images captured by a camera. A video camera converts a moving image into electronic signals. The signals are transmitted to a monitor, which decodes them and reconstitutes the image for display. The most famous monitor, of course, is the television. First demonstrated in the United States in 1939 in connection with the opening of the New York World's Fair, television sets became standard fixtures in American homes around 1950. One of the first artists to work with video was Nam June Paik. Paik was as fascinated by television sets themselves, their evolving styles and designs, as by the moving video image. One of his best-known early works is TV Buddha, an installation in which a sculpture of the Buddha contemplates its own image on a futuristic-style television that resembles an astronaut's helmet. Or is it the video camera that contemplates the Buddha? The camera and its hookup to the television are in full view, for Paik wants us to be aware of the entire mechanism of the relationship. Past and future confront each other here, as do religion and secular entertainment. Alternative forms of representation and stillness and movement. Viewers appear briefly on the screen as they stand behind the statue, their fleeting presence contrasting with the eternal existence of the Buddha and the unblinking stare of the camera. There were several reasons why artists took quickly to video. One was that it could be recorded and then played back immediately on a monitor, eliminating the wait for film to be developed. Monitors, moreover, lent themselves well to exhibition in gallery spaces where new art was shown. Less than 5 minutes long, Third Tape by Peter Campus is a classic work of early video art. The video unfolds in 3 segments, each of which features a man performing an action that distorts or abstracts his image. In the first segment, he faces the camera and binds his head tightly with fishing line, cutting across his face, though he were slicing himself into cross-sections. In the second, a hand placed mirror tiles one by one on a black surface. In them is reflected a fragmented view of the man's face looking down from above. In the third segment, illustrated here, the camera looks up through a tank of water as the man gradually immerses his face in it, creating a strange effect. During the 1990s, digital video became available along with technology that allowed video stored directly on disk to be projected onto a wall or some other surface instead of being fed to a monitor. Because it can be fed into a computer for further manipulation, digital video gives artists access to the same programs that today's filmmakers use for editing, adding a soundtrack, and creating special effects. Iranian artist Shirin Neshat's most recent project shows how the worlds of the video artist and the filmmaker have drawn closer together. Neshat recently completed a series of 5 large-scale video installations inspired by Women Without Men, a novel by the contemporary Iranian writer Sharnoosh Parsipur. Women Without Men tell the story of a small group of women who live briefly together in a house with a large garden not far from the Iranian capital of Tehran. They come together by chance, each one having suffered and then escaped the world of male authority in her own way. Each of Neshat's brief videos take up the story of one of the women in the book, but it does not retell the story literally. Rather, it meditates freely on the story's events, themes, and imagery. Repeating imagery links the videos in subtle ways, as does the choice of actors, some of whom play more than one role across the series. Shown in gallery or museum spaces, the videos are projected onto the walls, each in its own room. Viewers can wander from one to the other in any order they choose. Neshat also made a full-length feature film inspired by the book, just as an independent filmmaker might. In contrast to the videos, the film offers a clearer story with characters whose development over time is more evident. The two projects illustrate how at least one artist draws a distinction between videos for a gallery setting and an art audience, and film for a theater setting and a cinema audience. Neshat, like the artist in the section before her, captured her own video using a camera. In contrast, Corey Archangel works with found videos such as outmoded video games and amateur videos posted on YouTube. To create his installation, various self-playing bowling games, Archangel collected 14 bowling video games dated from 1977 to 2001 and hacked their controllers so that the player characters throw nothing but gutter balls. Projected side by side in chronological order, various self-playing bowling games confronts us with failure on a cinematic scale. The machines play game after game, but no player ever scores. The animation technology gets better and better over time, but we still experience nothing but frustration. All you are left with, says the artist, is a repeated infinite letdown. The illustration here shows 6 of the games, all that would fit on the wall at the Whitney Museum in New York. The gallery in London that co-commissioned the work had a wall long enough to show all 14 games. Various self-playing bowling games is about the pathos of our infatuation with technology, the absurdity of identifying with virtual player in order to play a virtual game, and the worlds of the artist. The short circuits in human nature caused by everyone staring at their phones or being on Facebook all the time. The Internet. Thus far in this book, we have discussed the computer as a tool that expands the possibilities of older art forms, such as printmaking, photography, film, and video. Yet in addition to being a tool, the computer is a place. Images can be created, stored, and looked at on a computer without being given a traditional material form at all. With the development of the Internet, the World Wide Web, and browser applications capable of finding and displaying web pages, a computer became a gateway to a new kind of public space. one that was global in scope and potentially accessible to everyone. Not only could anyone find information on the internet, but anyone could also claim a presence on the internet by creating a site on the World Wide Web, a website. Artists that use the internet as a medium is known as an internet art, or more casually, a net art. Since its beginnings in the late 1990s, net art has typically taken the form of emails, web pages, or software, a set of step-by-step instructions that can be executed by a computer. Net art is often interactive, allowing visitors to explore space that has been created on the internet or influence an image as it evolves on the computer monitor. One of the early pioneers of net art was Russian artist Olya Lyalina. My boyfriend came back from the war. An interactive work she created in 1996 was one of the first examples of net art to become widely known. The slow speed of the dial-up internet service available at the time was an integral part of My Boyfriend Came Back from the War. Slowly loading frames of words and expressing images expressed the reunited couple's halting and painful conversation, punctuated by silences. A more recent work, Summer, depends for its effect on today's high-speed access. Summer is a graphics interchange format, GIF, animation like traditional animations. GIFs consist of a series of still images which, when shown sequentially at high speed, produce an illusion of motion. Summer consists of 21 frames designed to play in a continuous loop. Lyalina distributed them among 21 different servers, one frame per server. A computer has to leap from server to server and display each image instantaneously in order to play the GIF, which depicts Lyalina herself swinging from the location bar at the top of the browser window. The motion begins haltingly as the computer contacts each site and retrieves the frame it hosts. What happens next depends on whether all the servers happen to be running and how fast the viewer's connection is. Part of the pleasure of Summer is having the entire computer screen given over to someone doing nothing more than playing on a swing. But just as delightful is watching the 21 web addresses frantically cycling in the location bar, making it clear just how much effort it takes to provide the effect of effortlessness. I like to swing on the location bar of the browser, Lyalina says, and I like to know that the speed of swinging depends on the connection speed and that you can't watch the GIF offline. No phenomenon more clearly illustrates the idea of the internet as a place than online 3D virtual reality environment known as Second Life. Millions of people from around the world are residents of Second Life, where they can buy property, build, travel, explore, play, party, and meet other residents. Before they can do any of those things, however, they must select and name their avatar, the animated persona who will present them in the virtual world. Chinese artist Cao Fei is presented in Second Life as an avatar named China Tracy. For 6 months, Cao recorded China Tracy's experience in Second Life on video. From those many hours of material, she created a 3-part, 30-minute film called I Mirror. The opening credits announce it as a Second Life documentary film by China Tracy. As of this writing, a low-resolution version of I Mirror can be viewed on China Tracy's YouTube space, youtube.com/user/China Tracy. The first part of I Mirror is dominated by images of emptiness and the solitude. The second part chronicles a delicate romance between China Tracy and a man she meets, Hug Yue. Young and handsome in Second Life, he turns out to be an older American in real life, and toward the end of their bittersweet encounter, he meets her more honestly as an older avatar. The third part of I Mirror, documents some unknown residents of Second Life, at first singly, then in loving couples. The third part of I Mirror documents some unknown residents of Second Life, at first singly, then in loving couples, and finally as they are drawn by music to dance together. A melancholy and yet ultimately hopeful film, Eye Mirror is an example of a new artistic practice called Machinima from machine cinema, in which real-time computer-generated 3D video from such sources as online games or Second Life is recorded and used as raw material for a film, just as traditional filmmakers use shots of live actors in the real world. Recently, many observers have discerned the beginnings of a post-internet era. Post-internet does not mean that the internet is over, but that it is no longer new. We are accustomed to this presence. A generation has grown up that has always known it. Post-internet art may reside online, or it may take the form of an object, often one that embodies critical thinking about the internet itself, its visual culture, its networks of information and communication, and its role in our experience of the world. A clever, thought-provoking example of post-internet art is Aram Barthol's ongoing project, MAP. The central element of MAP is a large wooden sculpture that materializes the marker Google drops on its online maps to indicate a location. The map is switched when the map is switched to satellite view, the pin remains, now seemingly part of the real world. Barthol scaled his sculpture to the size the pin appears to be in the satellite's view's highest magnification. When we have zoomed in as close as the program will allow, the pin itself does not change size when the view is magnified. Only its scale in relation to the objects in the view changes. He brings his sculptural marker to a city and sets it up temporarily in the space that Google Maps designated as the city's center. Translated to physical space, the map marker questions the relation of digital information.
Translate.
That's funny. My phone came on when I said Google. Transferred to physical space, the map marker questions the relation of the digital information space to provide life. I'm sorry, y'all, I cannot read. Transferred to physical space, the map marker questions the relation of the digital information space to everyday life, public city space. He writes, the perception of the city is increasingly influenced by geolocation services. Communication technologies of the modern age, the camera and the computer, have transformed our world. They were not developed with art in mind, yet because artists chose to work with them, they have yielded new art forms for our era. And that's the end of chapter 9. I'm sorry, y'all. I can read, definitely read silently to myself. Reading out loud is not something I'm used to, and it's early in the morning. Probably shouldn't do this early in the morning. Should probably wait until I'm awake. But anyway, I was hoping to be able to help y'all out in some way by reading this aloud to you so you could listen to it anywhere you go. I highly recommend you go back and look at the images, maybe even look some of these up and watch them on YouTube or wherever they're available. Fascinating stuff here. Thank y'all for listening. Hopefully I'll be able to read chapter 10 later on when I'm wide awake and better at this. Thank you for listening.